On the day my wife passed away, I said nothing about the $40 million inheritance or about the other secret that would change everything, and that silence became the beginning of something greater. What followed reached far beyond wealth, unfolding into a test of love, patience, and the quiet power to endure, yet its full weight was only starting to emerge. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. I remember that morning with every detail carved into my mind, the air still heavy with the scent of hospital disinfectant clinging to my coat as I returned home to face a world without her. My wife had been my partner in everything, the one who steadied me when I was young and reckless, the one who planned carefully for years when I only thought of today, the one who reminded me of what mattered when the world tempted me to stray. She was gone, and as relatives began arriving with faces painted in grief and voices lowered in false sympathy, I carried not only my sorrow, but the knowledge of what she had left behind. To them, I was an old man who had just lost the most important person in his life. To myself, I was the keeper of $40 million that none of them had the faintest idea about. It would have been easy to speak then, to declare with a trembling voice that I was not as weak as I looked, that my wife and I had built something larger than any of them could imagine, that the legacy she left in my hands could change lives. But as I watched my son approach me with his shallow words of comfort, I felt a stirring inside me. His eyes did not shine with sorrow. They darted across the room as if calculating what would fall into his possession, and in that instant I understood my silence was not weakness. It was my shield. The day was long, stretched with prayers, condolences, and rituals that felt like a blur. I moved through it quietly, my mind not on the voices around me but on the woman I had lost. Every memory of her returned like a tide, pulling me under again and again. I thought of our late nights when she sat with papers spread across the dining table, whispering that we had to be careful, that we had to protect what we worked for. She had always seen more clearly than I did. She warned me that our son's hunger for comfort would one day turn into greed, and she made me promise to guard what we built. That promise weighed on me now, heavier than any coffin, heavier than any grief. I said little to those who came and went, offering food, tears, and platitudes. I let them believe I was lost in sorrow, too deep for words. In truth, my silence was deliberate. If I had spoken even a fraction of what I carried, it would have shifted the air in that room. Whispers would have risen, curiosity would have spread like fire, and soon enough hands would have stretched toward me, not to comfort but to claim. I would not let that happen. My wife's voice still echoed in my ears, calm and steady, reminding me that timing is everything. When night fell and the last visitor left, I sat alone in the quiet of my home. The silence was unbearable yet necessary. I looked at the old clock on the wall and realized that while the day marked the end of her life, it also marked the beginning of a new chapter for me. I had chosen to remain silent, and in that silence, I had taken control. No one knew about the $40 million. No one suspected the other secret I held close. And as the house creaked in the stillness of the night, I swore to myself that I would not let grief make me careless. My wife trusted me to carry this burden, and I would not fail her. That was only the beginning. What followed was a series of choices, confrontations, and revelations that would strip away the masks of those closest to me. But for that first day, silence was my answer to everything. It was the silence of grief, yes, but also the silence of power. And though my son believed me frail, broken, and vulnerable, he would soon learn that I was not merely mourning. I was waiting. The day of mourning began, with the gray light of dawn spilling through the curtains, and though the world outside stirred with its usual rhythm, inside my chest everything felt still and hollow, as if time itself had lost its will to move, and I rose slowly, my body heavy with grief, my mind clouded by the weight of knowing that my wife was no longer beside me, her voice no longer filling the morning silence with gentle reminders or quiet hums of the songs she used to love. And I found myself staring at the empty space on the bed where she had rested for years, that void more unbearable than any words of sympathy could ever address. Because how could anyone truly understand the absence of a partner who had been stitched into every fiber of my life? And as I moved through the house, each corner held memories like fragile glass, threatening to shatter with the slightest touch. And the smell of her perfume still lingered faintly in the air, teasing me with the illusion that she might suddenly walk in, yet I knew she would not. And the finality of it all crushed me as I prepared myself for the funeral rites that awaited, a day when others would gather to say their words, eat their meals, and then go home. But for me, it was a day that carved a permanent scar on my heart, one that would never fade. Relatives began to arrive early, their faces somber, their voices lowered, and I could see in their eyes the delicate balance between grief and curiosity. Because while some truly mourned her passing, others seemed more focused on the shadow of what her absence might mean, and though they placed their hands on my shoulder and offered practiced words of comfort, I felt the hollowness behind their gestures, a kind of sympathy that was polite rather than heartfelt. And I accepted it in silence, not because I believed their sincerity, but because I had no strength to correct them. And when my son finally appeared, walking in with a face that wore the proper mask of sadness, I studied him carefully, noticing how quickly his gaze shifted around the room, scanning the faces, the belongings, as though calculating something beneath the surface. And it struck me again that his grief was shallow, that his concern stretched only as far as what might be gained or lost in the wake of his mother's passing. The service itself was a blur, the chanting of prayers, the fragrance of incense rising in the air, the low hum of voices joining together, and while others wept openly, I sat motionless, my grief too deep to display in such a way, for mine was not the kind that could be washed out in tears, but one that pressed into my bones, leaving me weary and broken inside. And as I listened to the words being spoken about my wife, I thought not of what was being said, but of the nights we shared, the sacrifices we made, and the quiet determination she always carried, her belief that the future had to be protected, even when the present seemed uncertain, and the promise I made to her that I would be careful with what she left behind. The silence of that day was unlike any other, not just in the absence of her voice, but in the way the world seemed muted, as if every sound passed through a heavy curtain of sorrow. And though I greeted those who came to honor her, my words were few, my voice faint, because nothing I said could capture the depth of what I felt. And when the coffin was lowered into the ground, my chest tightened with the crushing reality that I would never again feel her hand in mine, never again share a glance that spoke volumes without a word, never again hear her laughter rising softly in the evening. And in that moment the world seemed unbearable. Yet I stood firm, knowing that the grief I carried could not be allowed to weaken me in the eyes of others, not when I was already keeping a silence far heavier than they could ever imagine. And as the mourners began to disperse, some with tears, some with whispers, I remained by her grave until the sky turned dusky and the chill of night began to settle, my heart heavy with sorrow, my mind already aware that this mourning was not just for her, but for the life we had built together, the love that had held me upright for decades, and the knowledge that I now bore alone the burden of both memory and responsibility. a burden I had no intention of relinquishing to anyone, especially not to those who had shown me that grief could be worn like a mask rather than felt like a truth. And as I finally walked away from the gravesite, I whispered to her one last promise, that I would not let her sacrifices be squandered, that I would honor her with silence and strength, and that this day of mourning, though filled with pain, would mark the beginning of a resolve that no one expected from an old man like me. It was barely hours after the burial when the true weight of my silence began to show itself, because instead of lingering in the sorrow of his mother's passing, my son revealed the restless impatience that had always simmered beneath his skin. And though I should not have been surprised, I still felt the sting when he approached me with words that carried the shape of comfort but the tone of calculation, speaking in hushed fragments about how life must go on, about how responsibilities would now fall upon us, about how certain matters had to be settled quickly. And though his mouth never formed the exact word inheritance, his meaning was clear enough to cut through the fog of grief surrounding me. And I knew he was already thinking not of his mother's memory, but of what her death might deliver into his hands. We had only just left the cemetery, the earth still fresh upon her grave, when he began his performance of concern, walking beside me, as though to guide my weary steps. But with every glance he cast, and every half-finished sentence, I could hear the hunger in his voice, the impatience gnawing at him, and I felt my heart sink as I realized that his mourning was nothing more than a mask thinly stretched over his greed. He spoke of the house as though it were already his to manage, noting repairs that should be addressed, speaking of how it might be more practical to move certain possessions, even suggesting that perhaps I would be better off somewhere smaller and quieter, all framed as kindness, yet each word laced with the same restless urgency that betrayed his true intent. I listened without answering, letting his words wash over me like cold water. And though my grief was still raw, I felt another kind of pain settling in my chest, sharper than sorrow, the pain of betrayal, the pain of watching my own flesh and blood reveal that the lessons his mother and I had tried to teach him about respect, patience, and compassion had never taken root. As the evening gathered and relatives filled the house with murmurs of remembrance, he hovered near me with a smile that did not touch his eyes, leaning in to whisper questions that he tried to cloak in innocence, asking how arrangements had been left, if my wife had prepared everything properly, if the lawyers had been in touch, and though he stopped short of pressing directly, it was clear to me that he was testing the waters, probing to see how much I might reveal in my state of weakness. I gave him nothing, only nods and vague acknowledgments, my silence like a wall he could not climb, and though he tried to disguise his frustration with small talk and forced laughter, I could see the flicker of annoyance each time I failed to take his bait, and it strengthened my resolve to remain still and let him stew in his impatience. I could hear my wife's voice echoing in my memory, warning me of this very moment, telling me that our son's eagerness for comfort would one day harden into entitlement, and I knew then that the silence I held was not just about protecting the inheritance. It was about protecting her wisdom, her foresight, and the legacy we had built with sweat and sacrifice, a legacy that could not be allowed to fall into careless hands. As the night wore on, and the visitors slowly trickled out, leaving behind the fading scent of flowers and food, my son lingered, his eyes darting toward the locked cabinet where he knew important documents were kept. And though he said nothing more that evening, I recognized the impatience that had taken root in him, an urgency that would not rest until he forced his desires into the open. For me, the day had been one of mourning, a day of silence and prayer for the woman I loved, but for him, it had been a countdown, a restless march toward the moment he could claim what he believed was owed. And as I watched him leave the house with his wife tugging at his arm, whispering something into his ear, I understood that this impatience would only grow, that he would soon shed the mask of courtesy and reveal the greed that had been waiting all along. And though my heart ached with grief, I braced myself for the storm that was certain to follow. A storm I would not meet with weakness, but with the same quiet strength that had carried me through the long years with my wife, because now I was fighting not just for myself, but for the promise I had made to her, a promise that would not bend under the weight of impatience or entitlement. When I think back on the path that led me to this moment, I cannot help but remember the sacrifices that shaped my life with my wife, the countless choices we made, the sleepless nights, the hard work that seemed endless, and the determination that bound us together when the world seemed intent on breaking us apart. And though my son may now look upon me as an old man holding a fortune he believes belongs to him, he cannot begin to understand the years that built it, the years when every dollar earned carried the weight of survival and every dream was measured against what we could afford to risk. And it was in those years that my wife and I forged not only a life but a legacy, one that was never meant to be squandered by impatience or greed. I remember the first house we bought, a small place with peeling paint and creaking floors. But it was ours, and we poured ourselves into it, every nail hammered, every wall painted, every corner scrubbed, because it was not just a house, it was a symbol of what we could accomplish together. And when my son was born, it was within those walls that he first cried, first laughed, and first learned what it meant to be part of a family, though I wonder now if those lessons ever truly stayed with him. My days were spent working long hours, often holding down 2 jobs, my hands calloused and my body weary. But I never once complained because I knew what I was working for, and each night when I came home to the sight of my wife waiting for me, her tired smile lifting the weight from my shoulders, I found strength to keep going, and together we built something far greater than money could measure. There were nights when bills piled higher than we could manage, when debts threatened to swallow us whole, and yet we never gave up, never surrendered to despair. Instead, tightening our belts, finding another way, and trusting that our sacrifices would one day bear fruit, and slowly they did as savings grew, investments paid off, and opportunities we once thought impossible came into reach. I remember watching my wife sit at the kitchen table late into the night, papers spread before her, calculating every expense, planning each move with precision, and though I often told her to rest, she would only shake her head and say we could not afford to lose focus, because she knew, as I did, that our sacrifices were not for ourselves, but for the future of our family, for the son sleeping in the next room, who depended on us for everything. We denied ourselves luxuries others seemed to enjoy so freely, skipping vacations, driving old cars long past their years, wearing clothes until they were threadbare. But every sacrifice was made with a purpose, every hardship endured with the vision of something better ahead. And while others may have seen only struggle, we saw progress, step by step, brick by brick, toward the life we dreamed of. When my son grew older, he never saw the strain, or perhaps he chose not to, because while we gave him the best education, the newest clothes, and the comfort of a home filled with love, he rarely asked what it cost us, rarely cared about the nights we spent worrying over how to stretch one paycheck to the next. And though I did not expect gratitude, I had hoped that one day he would understand that everything he enjoyed came from the sacrifices we bore in silence. My wife carried the heavier burden at home, raising him with patience and tenderness, shaping his days with discipline and care. And I will never forget the nights I returned home to find her exhausted yet still smiling, her arms wrapped around our son as if he were the greatest reward she could ever ask for. And in truth, he was our reward. The reason we sacrificed as much as we did. Looking back now, I see clearly that those years of sacrifice were not just about survival. They were about building a shield, a foundation strong enough to withstand time. And though my son may now hunger for the wealth we left behind, he cannot claim the sweat that earned it, nor can he comprehend the love that preserved it, because those memories belong only to my wife and me, and they are the reason I will not let his greed destroy what we built. Every moment of sacrifice was a brick in the fortress of our legacy, and even though my heart aches with her absence, I know she would want me to remember those days, not as pain, but as proof of what we could endure. Proof of why I must protect her legacy, even if it means standing against our own child, because those sacrifices deserve honor, not entitlement, and I will not let them be forgotten. The early signs of greed from my son were not loud or dramatic at first. They were small cracks that appeared slowly over the years, moments that at the time I tried to brush aside as youthful mistakes or immaturity. But when I look back now, I see them clearly for what they were, the roots of entitlement that grew stronger with every sacrifice we made for him, and the more we gave, the more he seemed to expect, as if generosity was not a gift, but an obligation. I remember the first time he asked for money beyond what we could easily provide, a casual request when he was still in school, phrased as though it were nothing at all, and though I hesitated, his mother pressed me with her gentle eyes, reminding me that he was our only child and deserved to have opportunities we never had. So I handed over the money and told myself it was a small thing. But in his eyes, I saw a glimmer of something unsettling, a look that told me he believed my giving was not a choice, but a duty. As the years passed, the requests grew larger, shifting from necessities to luxuries, from books to gadgets, from modest clothes to designer brands, and each time I reached deeper into my pocket, telling myself it was for his happiness, yet each time I noticed that his gratitude grew thinner, replaced by expectation, as though my hard work was simply a machine designed to keep him satisfied. When he entered college, the demands only multiplied. Tuition, of course, was ours to cover. But soon he wanted a car, not a modest one, but something that would turn heads on campus. And though I argued we could not afford it, his mother once again softened my resolve, believing it was worth the cost to see him smile. And so we stretched ourselves thinner, tightening our own lives while he lived with a comfort he had not earned. I recall the first time he returned home and scoffed at our house, calling it small, outdated, embarrassing compared to what his friends had, and though the words stung, I laughed it off, telling myself he was young, that he would learn in time the value of humility, but deep inside I felt the cut of his ingratitude. Over time his tone shifted whenever we spoke about money, no longer asking but pressing, no longer requesting but demanding, and when I reminded him of the struggles we had faced to give him everything he enjoyed, he would roll his eyes or wave me off, as if my sacrifices were ancient history, irrelevant compared to his current desires. I will never forget the day he told me that money was wasted on old people, that it should be passed down to the young who could enjoy it. And though he said it with a laugh, I could see he meant every word. His arrogance so firmly rooted that he believed his future was built not on his own labor, but on what we had accumulated for him. My wife saw it too, though she tried to excuse it with kindness, saying he was still learning, that life would eventually teach him discipline. But I could feel the difference in his heart, the widening gap between what we had tried to instill in him and what he had chosen to believe. Each holiday, Each visit seemed less about family and more about what he could take with him, whether money slipped into his pocket or gifts purchased at his suggestion. And I began to notice that his conversations with me rarely touched on my well-being, rarely asked about my health or my work, but almost always circled back to finances, to possessions, to the future, that he seemed certain would one day fall into his lap. It was in these early signs of greed that the truth began to reveal itself, though I ignored it at the time, blinded by love and the hope that he would grow wiser, that he would understand the weight of sacrifice and learn to carry himself with honor. But instead, each act of giving only fed the hunger within him, shaping him into a man who saw generosity not as love, but as weakness to be exploited. And though I did not yet know how deep his entitlement would run, I can see now that those small cracks were warnings, the first tremors before the quake, the quiet proof that one day my silence about the inheritance would not only protect what my wife and I built, but expose the greed that had been growing in him all along, hidden behind the smile of a son who believed the world owed him everything, simply because we loved him too much to deny him. When my son married, I hoped that the presence of a partner would steady him, that perhaps the love of a good woman would soften his impatience and guide him toward the virtues his mother and I had always tried to teach. But instead, I soon began to see how his wife, my daughter-in-law, became not a calming influence, but a sharpened edge that cut away what little humility he still carried. And though she was polite to me in public, always smiling and speaking with carefully chosen words, I could feel beneath the surface a restless hunger that matched his own, a hunger not for family or love, but for security built on wealth she had not earned. At first, it appeared in subtle ways, the way she encouraged him to dress more extravagantly, to live beyond his means, to view himself as someone destined for a life of luxury rather than work. And though I thought it might simply be the folly of youth, I could not ignore the whispers I overheard, her urging him to ask me for more, her suggestion that I should already be planning how to pass down the wealth she believed was hers by extension. During family dinners, I would watch her lean close to him, murmuring in his ear while her eyes flicked toward me, and soon after he would bring up the subject of money, never directly, but always skirting around it, planting questions about future arrangements, about properties, about how things might be handled when the time came. And though I kept my answers short, I could sense her frustration in the way her smile tightened, in the way her hand would squeeze his arm as if pressing him to push harder. There were times she would visit the house with him, and her gaze would linger not on the memories captured in photographs or the objects that carried stories of our lives, but on the furniture, the silverware, the artwork, assessing them not for sentiment, but for value, as though every piece she saw was already marked in her mind with a price tag. My wife once confided in me that she did not trust her, that behind her charm there was an ambition too sharp to be ignored, and she urged me to be careful, to remember that not everyone who enters the family does so with the heart of family. And though I wanted to believe otherwise, it did not take long for my wife's instincts to prove true. After my wife passed, the influence of my daughter-in-law became even clearer, for my son's impatience began to harden into demands, and I could hear in his words the echo of her persuasion, the rehearsed tone of questions, too deliberate to be his own, and I knew she was feeding his entitlement, whispering poison into his ear, convincing him that he must secure what he could while I was still alive, as if I were nothing more than a vault waiting to be opened. I remember one particular evening when she pulled me aside with feigned sweetness, telling me that I had worked hard enough and that it was time to let the younger generation handle things. her voice dripping with false concern, but her eyes cold and sharp, and I realized then that she saw me not as a father-in-law, but as an obstacle between her and the fortune she believed she deserved. Her influence was insidious, wrapping around my son until his own voice was no longer his alone, but a reflection of hers, and I could see how she flattered him, how she built his ego with promises of what they would do once the money was theirs, how she stirred his impatience until it boiled over into arrogance. Each interaction with her confirmed what my wife had always feared, that our son had married a woman who valued wealth above family, appearances above truth, and entitlement above gratitude. And though I tried to maintain peace for the sake of avoiding conflict, inside me the resolve was hardening. The certainty that I would never allow her influence to destroy the legacy my wife and I had built, because every dollar, every property, every investment carried the weight of sacrifice and love, not a prize to be seized by greedy hands, but a trust to be guarded. Watching her manipulate my son was like watching a puppeteer pull strings. Her whispers shaping his thoughts, her ambitions driving his actions, and I knew that the storm was only beginning, that soon their combined greed would rise against me with full force. And though it pained me to realize that my son had allowed himself to be molded by her desires, I also knew that my silence, my patience, and my strength would be the shield that protected not only what we built, but also the memory of the woman I loved, who had seen all this coming and who had trusted me to stand firm when the time arrived. In the days that followed my wife's passing, I chose silence as my companion, not out of weakness or confusion, but out of deliberate strength, because I understood that every word spoken too soon would become fuel for the fire of greed that smoldered within my son and his wife, and so I held my tongue even when their questions pressed closer, even when their eyes searched mine for answers. I refused to give, and though many mistook my quiet for frailty, I knew that silence was the only shield strong enough to protect the legacy entrusted to me. Each morning I woke to a house that felt colder without her presence. Yet I carried myself slowly, letting the world believe I was too consumed by grief to think clearly. And in truth, grief did weigh heavily on me, but beneath it all I was wide awake, watching, listening, measuring the impatience that grew louder with every passing day. My son would visit often, his tone wrapped in courtesy, but his words circling the same questions, and his wife would linger nearby, her eyes sharp and restless, and though they believed they were subtle, I could hear the edge of their hunger in every pause, every carefully chosen phrase. I would nod gently, speak of prayers, speak of memories, but never once did I allow the conversation to wander near the truth of what I held in my possession, for silence gave me power, and power gave me time. I thought often of my wife, of the many nights she reminded me that silence can be louder than speech, that a quiet man can learn more than a careless one. And I knew then that my silence was not just for me, but for her, for the promise I made to honor her wisdom. Relatives would ask if I needed help handling the estate. Neighbors would extend their sympathies. Yet I kept my responses simple, avoiding every attempt to draw me into details, because I knew how quickly whispers travel, how quickly speculation becomes rumor, and how easily rumor feeds the greed of those already waiting for opportunity. I watched as my son grew more impatient, his mask of courtesy slipping when he thought I could not see, his voice rising in frustration when he spoke to his wife in the corner of the room, and I realized that my silence unsettled him more than any outright refusal ever could, because in his mind the unknown was unbearable, a darkness he could not control, and that darkness gnawed at him until it shaped his every thought. I let him believe what he wished, that I was too fragile to act, that I was too broken to notice, that I was clinging to grief while the world moved past me. And in that false image he revealed himself more and more each day, showing me not love or patience, but the true measure of his entitlement. And with every impatient sigh, with every veiled question, I grew more certain that my silence was the right choice. There were times when I wanted to shout, to remind him of the years of sacrifice, to tell him of the long hours I worked so he could enjoy the comforts he took for granted, to make him understand that what I carried was not simply money, but decades of love and labor. But I bit my tongue, holding it all inside, because I knew he would not hear me. Not yet. Not while greed blinded him. And so silence became my lesson, my quiet way of teaching him that not everything could be demanded, not everything could be seized simply because he believed it was owed. At night, when the house was empty and I sat alone with her photograph, I spoke softly to her, telling her of the questions he asked, of the looks his wife gave, of the whispers I overheard, and I promised her that my silence would not break, that I would carry her wisdom as a shield, that I would not allow their greed to dismantle what we built together, and though the loneliness pressed heavily on me, I found strength in knowing that silence gave me control, silence gave me the advantage, and silence gave me the patience to wait until the time was right to reveal the truth. The truth of the inheritance was something I kept locked tightly within me, a secret my wife and I had guarded for years, because we both understood that what we built was not meant to be handed away carelessly. And though others may have seen us as simple, living modestly in a house that showed little sign of great wealth, the reality was far different. For hidden behind our ordinary lives was a carefully structured fortune, amounting to $40 million, protected in ways that few could imagine, and it was under my control alone. My wife was the first to see how necessary it was to hide it. She was the one who insisted that we plan for every possibility, and I remember the long nights when she and I sat at the table with papers spread wide, going over details until our eyes ached, creating trusts, diversifying investments, securing properties, and making sure that no single hand could snatch it away with ease. And though I sometimes grew tired of the meticulous planning, I see now that her foresight was the reason I could sit in silence after her passing, knowing that everything was secure. To the outside world, we were careful to appear as if we had only enough to live comfortably, never flaunting what we owned, never boasting of what we had earned, and because of that many underestimated us, believing that old age had left us with little more than memories. But within our control were assets that stretched far beyond what anyone suspected. The accounts were layered through trusted institutions, the properties shielded by names that could not be easily traced, and the legal documents tied everything so firmly that even the most desperate hands would find them impossible to break. And I often marveled at my wife's brilliance in ensuring it was so, for while I had labored with my hands to earn, she had labored with her mind to protect. I thought often of the day she told me that one of our greatest mistakes would be to place everything openly in our son's path, because she knew his heart better than I did. She knew that comfort had spoiled him, that entitlement had hardened in him, and she feared what would happen if he ever believed he was entitled to everything we had fought to build, and her words became the foundation of our decision to hide it. Now that she was gone, I sat with the knowledge that I alone held the keys to that fortune, that my silence was not just about grief but about protection. And though my son prowled with questions and his wife sharpened his impatience, neither of them had the faintest idea of the truth, and I intended to keep it that way until the time was right. The hidden inheritance was more than money. It was a shield for our legacy, a safeguard against waste, and a weapon in the lesson I was preparing to teach, because nothing reveals the character of a person more clearly than how they behave when they believe something valuable is just out of reach. As I moved through the house in those days after her funeral, I often passed by the locked cabinet where the first layer of documents was kept, and though I never opened it in front of anyone, I would sometimes touch the key in my pocket, reminding myself that I was the keeper of something much larger than myself, and that I must remain steady. My silence, combined with the security of the inheritance, gave me strength. For no matter how many questions my son asked, no matter how many whispers his wife sent into his ear, they would not find a single crack in the walls we had built. And they would grow more frustrated with each passing day, revealing their greed more openly, while I held firm with the knowledge that I controlled the one thing they desired most. At night, I spoke softly to my wife's photograph, promising her that I would not fail, that the inheritance she had fought so hard to protect would remain safe, that our son would not squander it, and that one day he would understand what true value meant, even if the lesson came with pain. The hidden inheritance was my burden and my weapon, and though the weight of it pressed heavily upon me, I carried it with pride, because it was the last gift we built together, the last secret she entrusted to me, and I would not let it fall into ungrateful hands. In the quiet nights after her passing, when the house echoed with emptiness and my heart felt heavy with both grief and responsibility, I often found myself replaying the memories of my wife's wisdom, because she was not only the love of my life, but also the anchor of my decisions, the steady hand that guided me when I was too hasty, the clear voice that reminded me of what truly mattered. And it was her wisdom that shaped the way we protected our fortune, her foresight that taught me how to stand firm now that she was gone. I remember countless evenings when she would sit across from me at the dining table, her eyes bright with determination even after long days of work, gently pushing me to think ahead, to plan for the future rather than live only for the present. And though I sometimes resisted, wanting to believe that things would work themselves out, she never allowed me to settle for uncertainty. She pressed me to secure every step. She had a way of speaking softly, yet leaving no room for doubt, reminding me that wealth without discipline could be a curse, that generosity without boundaries could destroy instead of build, and she would often say that money is like water. It can give life or it can drown, depending on whose hands hold it. Those words ring in my ears even now, and I see how perfectly she understood the dangers of our own son's character, how she saw with clarity what I refused to admit, that his hunger for comfort would one day transform into a demand for control. Many nights, we stayed awake long after the world had gone quiet, her hands moving over the papers as she reviewed investments, trusts, and property deeds, her voice calm but unwavering as she explained why each choice mattered. And I listened, often weary from long hours of labor, yet always comforted by her vision, for she carried within her the ability to see beyond the moment, to prepare for storms long before their clouds appeared. I recall her telling me that one day silence would be my greatest weapon, that when faced with impatience and greed, speaking too soon would only feed the fire, and though I did not fully understand it then, I see now that she was right, because my silence has forced our son to reveal himself piece by piece, showing his true nature without me needing to provoke him. Her wisdom was not confined to matters of money. It extended into every corner of our lives, guiding me to raise our son with love even when he did not reciprocate, urging me to forgive small insults to preserve peace, teaching me that strength is not always found in confrontation, but in restraint, and that the measure of a man is not in how loudly he speaks, but in how firmly he stands when tempted to bend. She would often remind me that the truest legacy is not the fortune itself, but the discipline and values tied to it. And that is why we worked so hard to hide what we had built, to protect it until the right time, because she feared that without guidance, our son would see only the number and not the meaning behind it. Her voice lingers with me in every decision I make now, as if she is still here, whispering reminders in the stillness of the night, urging me to be strong, to be patient, to remember that our work was not just for him, but for the dignity of the sacrifices we made together. There is one memory that plays often in my mind, a late evening when she looked at me with a seriousness I could not ignore, and she said, "Promise me that you will not let him waste what we have built. Promise me you will guard it even if it means standing against him." And I gave her that promise, one I now carry like a shield around my heart. Her wisdom was the light in our darkest moments, and even in her absence it continues to guide me, reminding me that silence, patience, and strength will protect what we built better than any words could. And though the loneliness of her absence cuts deep, I find solace in knowing that I am honoring her not only by remembering her, but by living out the lessons she left me, the lessons that now form the foundation of my resolve to protect our legacy at all costs. The first confrontation came sooner than I expected, though deep down I had always known it would arrive, because impatience does not stay hidden for long, and greed has a way of forcing its way into the open. And one evening, my son came to the house without pretense, his words no longer wrapped in half-hearted sympathy, but sharpened with direct intent. And for the first time since his mother's funeral, he stripped away the mask of courtesy and revealed the hunger that had been gnawing at him from the beginning. He sat across from me in the living room, his wife nearby, pretending to busy herself with her phone, though I could see her eyes flicker toward us with every sentence, and he began with a sigh that carried false weariness, telling me how difficult things had been for him lately, how expenses were piling up, how he was carrying too many burdens, and I listened quietly, knowing exactly where the conversation was headed. Then his voice hardened and he leaned closer, his eyes narrowing with expectation, and he asked me outright how much money his mother had left behind, how much I had control over. And when I hesitated, he pressed further, saying that as her only child, he had the right to know, that it was unfair for me to keep such matters to myself, and his tone was not that of a grieving son, but of a man demanding a share of what he believed was already his. My silence unsettled him. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, and when I finally spoke, it was only to remind him that the subject was neither simple nor appropriate, especially so soon after burying his mother. But he waved off my words with irritation, his impatience boiling over as he insisted that time was irrelevant, that responsibilities did not wait for grief to fade, and that the sooner matters were settled, the better. His wife finally joined in, her voice smooth but firm, suggesting that it would be wise to have everything out in the open, that clarity would prevent misunderstandings. And I felt a coldness settle in my chest as I realized they had come together prepared, rehearsed even, to corner me into giving them what they wanted. I sat back and let their words pour over me, their urgency like a flood battering against the dam of my silence. But I held firm, refusing to give them even a hint of what they sought, because I knew that once I opened that door it would never close again. My son grew more frustrated, his voice rising as he accused me of hiding things, of being unfair, of treating him like a stranger rather than my own flesh and blood. And though the words cut deep, I reminded myself that his anger was proof of his greed, that his mother had been right all along about the danger of giving him too much. I wanted to tell him then of the sacrifices we had made, of the nights his mother stayed awake protecting every penny, of the years I had given my strength so he could live in comfort. But I bit down on those words, choosing silence instead, because I knew they would not land on ears clouded with entitlement. The confrontation stretched longer than I expected, the air thick with tension, until finally I rose to my feet and told him gently but firmly that the conversation was over, that we would not discuss money that night or any other night unless I chose to. And the shock on his face was quickly replaced with anger as he realized I would not bend. His wife pulled at his arm, urging him to let it go for the moment, and though he eventually stormed out with a promise that this was not the end, I remained seated in the silence of the house, my heart heavy, not from fear, but from sorrow, because in that moment I saw how little of his mother's wisdom lived within him, and how much of her fears had come true. The first confrontation had ended, but I knew it was only the beginning. And as I sat alone with her photograph on the mantel, I whispered to her that I was ready, that I would not falter, and that, though our son had turned his hunger into accusations, I would remain the guardian of what she entrusted to me, no matter how many confrontations lay ahead. The pain I felt after that first confrontation was unlike any grief I had ever known, because losing my wife had already carved a hollow in my heart. Yet to see my own son treat me not as a father but as a gatekeeper to fortune left me with a wound that cut even deeper, a wound that could not be soothed by time or prayer, for it was the betrayal of blood, the shattering of trust, the undeniable proof that the child I had raised with love and sacrifice saw me not as a man who had given him everything, but as an obstacle standing between him and wealth. I sat alone in the quiet house after he stormed out, the echo of his angry words still ringing in my ears, and I felt a heaviness press down on my chest, the kind of pain that no doctor could cure, because it came not from sickness, but from sorrow. I had always imagined that in my later years I would be surrounded by warmth, that though life would naturally bring loss, the bond with my son would be my comfort. Yet instead I found myself staring at his greed, at his impatience, at the arrogance that made him feel entitled to demand what was never promised, and it crushed me to think that my love had raised a man who could look into my weary eyes and see only dollar signs. I remembered the nights I had worked until my hands ached, the mornings I left before sunrise, the countless hours spent not for myself but for him, believing that every sacrifice was worth it because I was building a future for my family. And now that same son repaid me not with gratitude but with accusation, telling me I was unfair, telling me I was hiding what should be his. And though his words burned, what hurt most was the absence of love behind them, the coldness in his voice, when he looked at me as though I were a barrier rather than a father. My wife's absence made the pain sharper still, because she had always been the one to comfort me in times of disappointment, the one who would place her hand over mine and remind me of the good that still existed. But now she was gone, and I faced this heartbreak alone, whispering to her photograph as if it could hear me, asking her if we had gone wrong somehow, if we had given too much, if our kindness had been mistaken for weakness. The house felt heavier with every step I took, each corner filled with memories of joy that now seemed tainted by the bitterness of the present. And though I tried to remind myself of her wisdom, that silence and patience were weapons, I could not deny the ache that settled deep in my bones. It was not only the betrayal of my son that weighed on me, but also the realization that in his hunger he had erased his mother's memory, treating her life as nothing more than a transaction that ended in his favor, forgetting the laughter she gave him, the lessons she taught him, the sacrifices she made so he could stand tall. That thought alone pierced me more than his harsh words, because it proved that the bond she cherished so dearly meant little to him, and I wondered how she would feel if she were here to see the man he had become. The father's pain is not just in being forgotten, but in being used, in seeing the years of devotion reduced to calculations. And in that moment I understood why she had insisted we protect the inheritance, why she had warned me of his heart, why she had pressed me to make a promise to guard everything, even if it meant standing against him, for she had seen long ago what I only now faced directly. As the night stretched on, I sat in the living room surrounded by silence, the clock ticking like a reminder that time does not pause for sorrow, and I let myself feel the pain fully, because it was the only way to carry it. But even through the tears that filled my eyes, I found a spark of resolve, the faint strength her memory gave me, telling me that though the betrayal of my son cut deep, I could not allow it to break me. The pain would remain, yes, but so would my duty, and if protecting our legacy meant enduring this heartbreak, then I would endure it, for my wife, for the sacrifices we made, and for the truth that love is measured not by words, but by the strength to protect what was built with it, even when that protection came at the cost of a father's heart. That night, after the sting of my son's words refused to leave me, and the weight of his betrayal pressed like a stone against my chest, I came to a decision that marked a turning point in my life. Because grief could no longer be my only companion, sorrow could no longer be my only language, and though my heart ached with the pain of losing my wife and the deeper wound of seeing my son's greed, I felt something within me harden into a quiet strength, a cold resolve that I had never known before, and it was born not out of hatred but out of duty. The duty to honor the woman who had given me her life and her wisdom, the duty to protect the legacy we had bled for, and the duty to stand firm even if it meant standing alone. I sat in the dim light of the living room, the house still heavy with silence, and I looked at the framed photograph of my wife on the mantel, her gentle smile frozen in time, and I whispered to her that I would not falter, that I would not let our sacrifices be undone by impatience or greed, and in that moment I felt her presence steadying me, as if her hand was once again on mine, guiding me forward. The cold resolve did not erase my pain. It did not heal the wound left by my son's betrayal, but it transformed the ache into something sharper, something that would not bend, because I realized that weakness now would be fatal. Weakness now would mean surrendering everything we had built, and I could not, would not, allow that. My son believed me frail, believed that grief had left me broken, believed that his demands would wear me down, but what he failed to understand was that silence had given me time to see his true nature, time to feel the weight of my promises, and time to prepare myself for the battles ahead. And though I loved him still as a father must, my love would not blind me to the truth any longer. I thought of the nights my wife and I planned in secret, her steady voice explaining how trusts and accounts were layered to protect us, her careful hand writing down details to ensure nothing was left vulnerable, and I knew that everything we had done was for this very moment, for the day when greed would come knocking, and I realized that to honor her was to use what she had prepared, to wield the tools she had given me with the discipline she demanded. My resolve grew colder as I pictured my son's face twisted with anger when I refused to answer his questions, the way his wife's eyes glittered with frustration when her charm failed to sway me, and I told myself that I would meet them both with the same silence, the same unshakable strength, because no pleading, no threats, no manipulation would move me. In that silence I found clarity, a determination that grief could not drown. And though I felt the loneliness of standing without her beside me, I also felt the weight of her faith. the trust she had placed in me to finish what we started, and I knew I could not let her down. That night, I slept very little, but in those sleepless hours, I felt something shift inside me, the softness of sorrow giving way to the steel of resolve. And when the morning light entered the room, I rose, not as a broken old man, but as the guardian of our legacy, prepared to face whatever storms our son and his wife would bring. The cold resolve wrapped itself around me like armor, and though it made me feel distant from the warmth of love, I understood that sometimes love demands firmness, sometimes love demands protection, and sometimes love demands silence that feels cruel but is, in truth, the greatest act of care. I told myself again and again that this fight was not about denying him, not about punishing him, but about protecting the sacrifices of a woman who gave her life to build something enduring, and about ensuring that her wisdom, her foresight, and her love were not lost to careless hands. The cold resolve became my new heartbeat, steady and unyielding, and I swore that no matter what he said, no matter what he did, I would not break, I would not yield, and I would carry her memory with me as both shield and weapon until the very end. After my resolve hardened into something unshakable, I knew that silence alone would not be enough to protect what my wife and I had built, because greed is relentless and impatience grows teeth when it is denied. And I could not allow myself to rely only on willpower when so much was at stake. So I made the decision to consult professionals, the very people my wife and I had spoken of countless times late into the night, and though walking into their offices felt heavy with the weight of secrets, I carried myself with the quiet determination that had become my shield. The first visit was to our lawyer, a man who had known us for decades, who had drawn up the initial documents when we first decided to secure our fortune. And when I entered his office with my cane tapping against the floor, he rose with genuine respect, greeting me not with shallow sympathy but with understanding, for he knew the battles that come when money mixes with family. We sat together, and I explained what had already begun, the questions from my son, the whispers from his wife, the confrontation that left me certain they would stop at nothing to pry from me what they believed was theirs, and the lawyer listened in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes sharp with the kind of focus that gave me confidence. He reminded me that everything was already structured to withstand pressure, that the trusts were ironclad, that the accounts were shielded, that the foundations were written in such a way that no impatient heir could simply demand access. And yet he also urged me to take additional measures to ensure that no loophole, no technicality, no careless oversight could ever undo what we had built. And I agreed without hesitation because my resolve demanded action. Together, we reviewed documents, signed new provisions, tightened protections, and updated clauses to leave no doubt about my authority. And though the work was tedious, it gave me a sense of peace, as though each paper signed was another stone laid in the fortress that guarded her memory. Afterward, I met with our banker, a woman my wife had trusted, who understood the layers of investments we had chosen. And when I explained my concerns, she nodded knowingly, saying she had seen families torn apart by greed more times than she could count. And she assured me that discretion and protection would remain her priority, guiding me through accounts and balances, helping me move portions into places even more secure, places where prying eyes would never reach. With each professional I consulted, my confidence grew, because I was no longer standing alone in the shadow of their impatience. I was standing with the strength of the law, the expertise of those trained to safeguard legacies, and the memory of my wife who had urged me to seek exactly this path. The more I acted, the lighter I felt. Not because the burden had lessened, but because I knew I was honoring her wisdom, taking the steps she had once outlined in careful detail, and each decision was like a conversation with her, as if she were still here guiding me, her voice steady in my mind. My son, of course, knew nothing of these meetings, and I let him believe that I was too lost in grief to act, too weary to think, because the more he underestimated me, the easier it became to move in silence, and the more frustrated he grew, the clearer his true nature revealed itself. I did not tell a soul of the protections I was putting in place, not a neighbor, not a relative, not even those who might have meant well, because secrecy was my greatest ally. And I understood that silence and preparation together formed a shield that greed could never penetrate. By the end of those days spent consulting professionals, I returned home with folders tucked beneath my arm and a calmness in my chest, and though the house still felt empty without her, I knew she would be proud, because every choice I made was a reflection of her foresight. Every step I took was in service of the promise I had made to her, and though my heart still ached with the pain of betrayal, I found strength in the certainty that our legacy was no longer just a treasure hidden in silence, but a fortress sealed by law, by trust, and by unshakable resolve. The day my son gave me his ultimatum is etched into my mind as clearly as the day I buried his mother, because it revealed to me just how far his greed had consumed him and how little of the boy I once raised remained within the man now standing before me. And though his words were sharp, what wounded me most was the absence of love behind them, the coldness that turned our bond into nothing more than a negotiation. He arrived without warning, his wife at his side, her expression tight with impatience, and they entered my home, not as family coming to share time with me, but as conquerors ready to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. And from the moment they sat down, I knew there would be no pretense, no false sympathy, only demands sharpened by weeks of frustration. My son leaned forward, his voice low but firm, telling me that enough time had passed since his mother's death, that matters had to be settled, and that he could no longer wait in uncertainty while I kept everything to myself. And though he tried to frame it as concern for my well-being, I could hear the steel beneath his words, the impatience of a man who had rehearsed every line before stepping through my door. When I remained silent, letting him speak, his tone hardened, and he declared that if I did not reveal the truth of the inheritance, if I did not hand over what he believed was his, then he would cut me off completely, remove himself from my life, leave me to grow old in solitude without the comfort of his presence. The words struck me like blows, because they were not the pleas of a son desperate for clarity, but the threats of a man who saw his father as a vault, and in that moment I realized that he was not trying to preserve family ties. He was using them as leverage, offering me his company as though it were currency to be bought with millions. His wife sat beside him, silent but smug, her eyes flickering with triumph, as if she believed the ultimatum would break me, as if the fear of loneliness would pry the truth from my lips. But she underestimated the strength my wife had left me, the promise I had made to protect what we built, and though my heart ached with the cruelty of his words, my resolve only grew colder. I looked at him, and saw not the boy who once clung to my hand as we crossed the street, not the child who once cried in the night and found comfort in my arms, but a man who had allowed greed to strip him of compassion, and it brought me a pain sharper than any physical wound. Yet, even as the ache filled me, I understood that his ultimatum was not my defeat, it was his exposure, because by speaking those words he revealed his heart to me fully, leaving no room for doubt, no space for excuses, and in that clarity I found strength. I told him calmly that I would not be threatened, that if his love for me was tied to the inheritance, then it was not love at all, and his face twisted with rage, his wife's smile faltering for the first time as she realized I would not bend. He rose quickly, his voice rising with accusations, calling me selfish, cruel, ungrateful for all that he believed he had done for me, and though each word pierced me, I held steady, my silence and calm reply cutting deeper than any argument could. When he stormed out, slamming the door behind him, the house shook with the echo of his anger, and I sat alone in the silence that followed, feeling both the sting of loss and the weight of triumph, because though my son had turned his back on me, I had kept my promise to my wife, I had not yielded to threats, I had not betrayed the trust she had placed in me, and that knowledge gave me strength even in the sorrow. The ultimatum marked a breaking point, the moment when love was tested and found wanting. But it also marked the moment when I knew I could face whatever came next, because no matter how much pain it brought me, I would not trade my integrity or my wife's memory for the hollow comfort of a son who valued me only for what I possessed. The moment finally came when I could no longer remain only silent, when I had to reveal the strength that my wife and I had carefully hidden behind years of modest living and quiet planning. Because my son's ultimatum had shown me that patience alone would not stop him, and though I had endured his accusations, his anger, and his threats, I knew it was time to remind him that I was not weak, that I was not frail, and that the legacy he believed he could seize was far beyond his reach. He returned one evening, still simmering with frustration, his wife at his side urging him forward with every glance, and I could see in his eyes the certainty that I would finally give in, that the fear of loneliness would force me to surrender. But instead of breaking, I met him with a calmness that unsettled him, because calmness in the face of demands is a kind of power no rage can pierce. He began again with his questions, this time sharper, this time framed as rights rather than requests, telling me that he deserved answers, that he was owed clarity, that as the only child he should not be kept in the dark. And when his wife added her voice, saying that it was cruel to withhold what naturally belonged to them, I felt a quiet fire rise within me. The fire of resolve forged in nights of planning with my wife. The fire of promises made beside her grave, and I knew it was time to let them see the truth they had so badly underestimated. I leaned forward, my voice steady though my heart pounded with both sorrow and strength, and I told them plainly that the $40 million was untouchable, secured in ways they could not begin to imagine, locked behind structures of law and trust that no impatient air could ever pierce. And as the words left my mouth, I saw the flicker of shock ripple across their faces, the disbelief that the fortune they had been circling for weeks was not within their grasp. My son tried to speak, his voice breaking with anger, but I raised my hand and continued, telling him that not only was the inheritance beyond his control, but there was also another secret, another layer of strength that neither he nor his wife had ever suspected. And their expressions shifted from arrogance to unease as they realized that I had not been passive or frail, I had been waiting. I told them that their impatience had revealed their character, that their greed had exposed their hearts, and that I would not entrust a single cent, a single property, or a single decision to hands that could not even honor their mother's memory for more than a day before demanding what she left behind. The silence that followed was heavy, my words hanging in the air like a weight pressing down on them, and I could see in my son's eyes the struggle between anger and disbelief, the way his wife's lips tightened as if she wanted to shout but could not find the words. For the first time, I felt the strength of truth on my side, not just silence, but revelation. The kind of revelation that strips away illusions and leaves nothing but reality. And though it pained me to speak so harshly to my own blood, I knew it was necessary, because some lessons cannot be whispered, they must be delivered with the force of finality. I stood then, my hand resting on the mantel where her photograph watched over me, and I told them that I would protect her legacy with my last breath, that the fortune was not theirs to demand, not theirs to squander, and that I would die guarding it if I had to. And as the words settled between us, I saw in their faces the dawning realization that I was not the man they thought I was, not a broken old father ready to yield, but the sole gatekeeper of everything they desired, and that their power over me was nothing compared to the strength of the love and wisdom my wife had left in me. They left in silence that night, their anger unspoken but visible in their eyes. And though the house grew quiet again, I felt a different silence this time, not one of grief alone, but one of power, because I had finally revealed the strength that had always been mine. And in doing so, I honored not only myself, but the woman who had trusted me to carry it when she could not. When I revealed that there was more than the $40 million, I saw the shift in their expressions, the flicker of shock that broke through their arrogance, because what they thought was the full measure of our legacy was only part of the truth. And it gave me a certain grim satisfaction to watch their confidence falter as I began to speak of the hidden asset, the secret my wife and I had guarded even more carefully than the inheritance itself, for this was not simply money locked in accounts or properties secured by trust. This was the crown of our efforts, the treasure built from years of foresight, and it belonged to me alone. I told them that beyond the fortune they had been salivating over, there existed another layer of security, something no lawyer's office could be pressured into revealing, something no banker's signature could unlock, because it was tied only to me. And in that moment, their eyes widened as if they realized how little they truly knew of me, how much of my life had been hidden from the son who thought he understood everything. My wife had always said that a man's true strength is not in what he shows but in what he conceals until the right time, and this hidden asset was the very embodiment of that wisdom. Over the years, while my son was busy enjoying the comforts we provided, I was quietly acquiring more than what he could see. Small businesses invested in, properties purchased under careful names, shares accumulated piece by piece until they became something substantial, and while the world thought I was merely a man scraping by for my family, I had been building an empire in shadows, not for glory, but for security, not for display, but for protection. And now it stood as the final proof that his greed would never touch what we had built. I explained to him, calmly and deliberately, that this hidden asset was beyond his imagination, that it was structured in such a way that it could never be transferred without my will, and that will was mine alone to decide, not his wife's, not anyone's. And as I spoke, I saw the flush of anger rise in his face, the way his wife's hand clenched tightly against her lap as if she were holding herself back from exploding, because they had believed their persistence would eventually break me. Yet here I was, revealing that their demands had only uncovered more distance between us, more walls they could never climb. I told them that while the $40 million was untouchable, this hidden asset was even more sacred, for it carried not only financial weight, but also the dreams my wife and I had spoken of, the visions she painted late at night, when she said our sacrifices would one day secure not just wealth, but meaning. And that meaning was something they had never earned, something they could never appreciate. My voice did not rise. My tone did not break. I remained steady as I explained that I alone decided its fate, and in that steadiness lay a strength they could not challenge, because fury has no power against calm truth. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, their eyes darting between each other, and I could see their thoughts racing, searching for some way to twist my words, some way to pry open what I had just shut forever. But there was nothing left for them to grip. My son finally muttered that I was being cruel, that I was betraying him, that I was choosing to abandon my blood, and though the words cut deeply, I reminded him that blood without loyalty is nothing, that love without respect is empty, and that a son who threatens his father has already abandoned what it means to be family. The hidden asset remained mine, a secret-turned shield, and though revealing its existence carried risks, I saw the necessity in showing them just how powerless their greed truly was. And as they left that night, with anger trembling in their steps, I stood alone in the quiet house with her photograph watching over me, whispering to her that I had kept my promise, that I had not only guarded the fortune but also the heart of our sacrifices, and that though the weight of this battle was heavy, I would carry it with pride because I knew the hidden asset was safe, untouched, and still bound to the love and wisdom of the woman who had trusted me with everything. The shock on my son's face after I revealed the truth about the hidden asset was something I will never forget, because it was the moment when his arrogance cracked and the certainty he had carried for weeks dissolved into disbelief. And though he tried to mask it with anger, I saw clearly the fear that flashed in his eyes, the sudden realization that the man he thought was weak and broken had been holding all the power from the very beginning. For days he had walked into my house with confidence, believing that his demands would wear me down, that his wife's persistence would corner me, that my grief would blind me to his intentions. But now his voice faltered, his hands trembled slightly, and he stammered questions he could not frame into full sentences, as if his mind could not comprehend that his future plans built on entitlement had no foundation at all. He asked me how long I had kept this from him, his tone sharp but laced with uncertainty, and I answered him calmly, telling him that his mother and I had planned everything for years, that every step had been deliberate, and that our silence had been as important as the work itself. And as the words sank in, I could see the pride he once carried slip from his shoulders like a cloak torn away. His wife, usually so quick to speak, was struck silent, her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting between us with disbelief, and I knew she had never imagined a scenario where the old man she dismissed so easily could hold such strength, could reveal layers of security beyond her reach, and the bitterness of her silence told me she understood. Her influence had met a wall she could not break. My son tried to rally himself, his voice rising as he accused me of betrayal, insisting that he had a right to everything, that I had no justification to keep secrets from him. But his words carried less weight now. They sounded hollow, like the tantrum of a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was gone. And I met his fury with steady silence, letting him hear his own voice echo without reply, until even he began to falter under the sound of his desperation. The shock in his eyes was not only about the money or the hidden asset, it was about me. About realizing that the father he had dismissed as fragile was, in truth, stronger than he ever imagined. And the more he looked at me, the more unsettled he became, because he saw that I was not bending, not breaking, but standing taller than ever in the memory of his mother and the promise I had sworn to her. It pained me to see him unravel, to see him choke on his disbelief, because beneath the greed and arrogance he was still my son, Still the boy I once carried on my shoulders? Still the child who once clung to me in fear of the dark? And yet the man before me was no longer that child. He was someone shaped by entitlement, someone who believed love was measured in dollars, and the shock he felt was not just the discovery of my strength, but the collapse of his illusions that I existed only to provide for him. He demanded explanations I would not give, pressed me with accusations I would not answer, and when he realized my silence was impenetrable, he fell back into his chair with a look that blended anger and despair, a look that told me he finally understood that he could not control me, that his power over me had never existed. For a long time the room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock, each second cutting deeper into the space between us. And I sat there steady, letting him sit with his shock, letting him feel the weight of what he had uncovered. Because sometimes silence is not just protection, it is punishment, forcing another to face the truth without distraction. When he finally stood, his movements were unsteady, his voice lower than before. He muttered that this was not over, that he would find a way, but the tremor in his words betrayed him, because he knew deep down that his battle was already lost, that the shock he felt was not temporary but permanent, a fracture in his pride that would not heal. As I watched him leave with his wife close behind, I felt both sorrow and strength. Sorrow that it had come to this, strength that I had revealed myself at last. And as the door closed behind them, I whispered to my wife's photograph that the truth had been shown, that our son now knew he could not bend me, and though the pain of betrayal still lingered, I carried with me the satisfaction of knowing that his shock was proof of my victory, proof that silence and patience had achieved what anger never could. The day of public exposure arrived, not because I sought it, but because greed has a way of spilling into the open, and what had been whispered in corners and demanded behind closed doors finally erupted where others could see. And in that moment, the mask my son and his wife had so carefully worn slipped away, revealing to the entire family what I had already known for weeks, that their hearts were not filled with grief or love, but with entitlement, impatience, and hunger. It happened at a family gathering, one that should have been a time for remembrance, for sharing stories of my wife and honoring her life. But instead, it became the stage where their true nature was revealed. Relatives filled the living room, voices low, faces solemn, plates of food untouched as memories were exchanged, and for a time I let myself feel the warmth of kinship, the comfort of hearing her name spoken with love, until my son, unable to contain himself any longer, raised his voice above the quiet and turned the gathering into a tribunal. He began by speaking of responsibilities, framing his words as concern for me, saying that an old man should not be burdened with financial matters, that it was time for others to step in. And though his words were dressed in courtesy, his eyes betrayed the greed that drove them. Some nodded politely, not yet understanding his intent, but as he pressed further, his wife joining him with sharp interjections, it became clear to everyone that this was not about concern but about inheritance. He spoke openly of money, of properties, of how things should be passed down, and when I remained silent, letting him reveal himself, his frustration grew until he declared that I was being unfair, that I was hiding what should rightfully belong to him, and gasps rippled through the room as relatives realized the truth of his obsession. His wife added fuel to the fire, saying that it was irresponsible of me to cling to everything when the younger generation needed it more, her tone laced with arrogance, and I watched as the faces of those around us shifted, shock giving way to disapproval, disappointment settling over them like a shadow, because they had come to mourn and remember, not to witness a son stripping dignity from his father. For the first time, I spoke clearly, my voice carrying through the room, and I told them that everything was secure, that nothing would be handed to impatient hands, That greed had no place in the legacy my wife and I built, and the silence that followed was heavier than stone. My son tried to argue, his face red, his voice rising with desperation, but the more he spoke, the deeper he buried himself, for every word revealed not care or love but entitlement, and the relatives who had once looked at him with sympathy now looked at him with disappointment. One uncle shook his head, muttering that such behavior was disgraceful. An aunt wiped tears from her eyes as she said, "My wife would be heartbroken to see her son act so callously." And in that moment, the weight of family judgment fell not on me, but on him. His wife attempted to defend him, saying that they were only being practical, that someone had to take control, but the words rang hollow in the room filled with people who knew the difference between love and greed, between honor and entitlement. And I watched as their confidence crumbled under the gaze of those they had hoped to impress. I did not need to shout or argue. My calmness was enough, my steady refusal more powerful than any accusation. And when the gathering ended, the whispers were no longer about inheritance, but about the shame of a son who had chosen wealth over respect, and I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and vindication. Sorrow that my family had to see the rift so plainly, vindication that his greed could no longer hide behind polite words or private ultimatums, because now it stood exposed for all to see, and in that exposure, his power was gone. That night, when the house was quiet again, I sat alone with her photograph and whispered that the truth had finally come to light, that the family now knew what she had feared all along. And though my heart still ached with disappointment, I felt a measure of peace, knowing that her legacy was no longer shadowed by secrets, but protected by both silence and the undeniable exposure of the greed that sought to consume it. The fall of arrogance came slowly at first, but then all at once, like a tower built too high on a weak foundation finally crumbling under its own weight. And my son, who had once carried himself with the certainty of a man already rich, began to stumble as the truth of his greed spread through the family, leaving him stripped of the respect he had once taken for granted. And though I took no joy in watching his pride collapse, I could not deny the sense of justice in seeing arrogance meet its end. After the family gathering where his hunger for inheritance was laid bare, whispers followed him wherever he went, whispers not of admiration or sympathy but of shame, and relatives who once greeted him warmly now turned their faces with quiet disappointment, their eyes reflecting the disapproval his own mother would have shown if she were alive to see it. The arrogance that once filled his stride faltered as he realized the world he had tried to manipulate no longer bent to his will, and his wife, who had been the echo of his entitlement, grew bitter as she saw the glances of contempt directed at her as well, the silent judgment of those who recognized her influence in every word he had spoken. My son tried to hold on to his pride, tried to argue that he was only being practical, that planning for inheritance was not greed but responsibility. But the more he defended himself, the more foolish he looked, for no one believed him anymore. No one could ignore the venom with which he had attacked me. No one could forget the ultimatum he had issued to his own father. He began to visit less often, no longer storming into my house with demands. And when he did come, his words were shorter, his tone sharper, but his eyes betrayed the defeat he tried to hide, the awareness that he no longer held power over me or anyone else. His arrogance had once been a shield, convincing him he was untouchable, but now it was gone, leaving him exposed and fragile, and though he tried to mask it with anger, the truth showed in his trembling voice, in the way his wife scolded him under her breath, in the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching. For me, the fall of his arrogance was both painful and necessary. Painful because no father wishes to see his child broken. Necessary because only through his collapse could the lesson be learned that love and respect cannot be bought, that legacy cannot be demanded, that arrogance is nothing but a hollow mask that crumbles when faced with truth. I remembered the words of my wife, her warning that one day his pride would betray him, that his hunger would consume him, and I realized she had been right all along. For the son we had raised with love had chosen the path of entitlement, and only the weight of consequences could show him what he had lost. Relatives began to distance themselves. Invitations to gatherings grew fewer, and when he walked into rooms, conversations quieted, the air thick with the reminder of his disgrace. And though his wife tried to cling to the illusion of superiority, even she could not ignore the shifting tide. Their arrogance had carried them high, convincing them that fortune was theirs to seize. But now they were left standing on the edge of isolation, their pride in ruins, their reputation damaged beyond repair. I did not gloat. I did not taunt him. I simply carried on with the calm strength that had seen me through, and in my silence his arrogance withered further, because nothing unsettles the proud more than the quiet endurance of the one they tried to break. At night, when I sat alone in the living room, I thought of how far he had fallen, and though my heart ached with the pain of betrayal, I also felt a measure of relief, because the fall of his arrogance was proof that justice had been served, that his greed had not triumphed, and that the legacy my wife and I had built remained untarnished by the hands that sought to claim it. The fall of arrogance was not my victory alone. It was hers. It was the result of every night she spent planning, every warning she gave me, every sacrifice we made together. And as I whispered to her photograph, I told her that though our son had chosen a path of shame, we had done our part. We had stood firm, and the arrogance that once threatened to consume our legacy had finally collapsed into dust. The final word is not spoken in anger, but in reflection, because after all that has happened, after the grief of losing my wife, the betrayal of my son, the manipulation of his wife, the silence I chose, the strength I revealed, and the arrogance that finally collapsed, what remains is not rage but clarity. The clear knowledge that I have fulfilled the promise I made to the woman who gave me her life and her love, and that our legacy remains intact, untouched by the greedy hands that sought to seize it. As I sit alone in this quiet house, the walls heavy with memories, I find myself thinking not of the money or the hidden assets, not of the structures of law and trust that now safeguard everything, but of her, of the wisdom she shared, of the nights we planned, of the sacrifices that shaped our lives, and I feel a bittersweet peace knowing that though she is gone, I honored her in the truest way possible, by protecting what we built. My son may see me as stubborn, cruel, or unfair, but I know the truth, and so does everyone who witnessed the way he exposed himself, because love does not demand, respect does not threaten, and family does not reduce itself to ultimatums. And by choosing to guard our legacy, I did not betray him, he betrayed himself. The final word belongs not to his accusations or to his anger, but to the quiet dignity of silence, to the resilience of patience, to the strength of promises kept. And as I whisper to her photograph each night before I rest, I tell her that I did not falter, that I did not bend, that even when my heart broke, I stood firm for both of us, because what we built together was worth every sacrifice. The fortune remains protected. The hidden asset remains untouchable, and though my son walks in the shadow of shame, I hold no hatred for him, only sorrow that he chose greed over love, arrogance over humility, entitlement over gratitude, and yet I accept that his choices are his own, and I will not allow them to undo the years of labor and love that defined our lives. My final word is a lesson to him, though he may not hear it now, that wealth is not measured by what you take but by what you honor, that legacy is not inherited by demand but entrusted by trust, and that respect must be earned not through blood alone but through actions that reflect the values of family. Perhaps one day he will understand. Perhaps one day he will remember his mother's gentle voice, her patient hands, her unwavering love, and realize the depth of what he has lost. And if that day comes, I will not meet him with anger, but with the same calmness that has carried me this far, because though his choices wounded me, he will always be my son. And forgiveness is not weakness, but a final gift I can still give, should he ever seek it. But whether that day comes or not, my promise stands fulfilled, and that is enough for me. The final word is not his, it is mine. Spoken in the quiet strength of an old man who refused to let greed rewrite the story of a lifetime, spoken in the enduring echo of a woman's wisdom that guided me long after she was gone, spoken in the silence that proved louder than anger, sharper than threats, stronger than demands. The final word is this: love built our legacy, sacrifice protected it, and resolve to preserve it. And no betrayal, no impatience, no arrogance could take it away. As I close my eyes tonight, I know she is at peace, and so am I. For we have guarded what was ours, and in the end, the story was not about money at all, but about honor, about strength, and about the quiet victory of keeping a promise until the very last breath. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.